Hello. I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes now about how writers use different kinds of narration in their work. Now, when we talk about narration, we're talking really about the voice that tells a story. Think of it this way. For a story to exist, someone has to tell it. There has to be a voice that comes from a speaker to a receiver for a story to even happen. And that voice can come from someone inside the story, or it can come from someone outside the story. In other words, I can tell you a story that happened to me, and my voice would come from inside the story. I would be a character in the story. On the other hand, I could tell you a story that does not involve me. My voice would then come from outside the story. I would not be a character in the story. To make this distinction clear, I use different kinds of narration. As readers, we've developed technical terms for these kinds of narration so that we can easily distinguish the kind of voice that tells a story to us as readers. And the rest of this lecture will discuss those terms. Now, to start, let's consider first-person narration as opposed to third-person narration. The distinction is mostly in the pronouns. First-person stories use first-person pronouns, such as I, me, or mine. Similarly, third-person stories use third-person pronouns, such as he, she, him, her, or they. As you can probably guess, first-person stories tend to come from inside the story, while third-person voices tend to come from outside the story. First-person stories have voices that come from characters within the story that they're telling, while third-person stories have voices that come from outside the story, often in the form of a narrator whose name we never know, whose character we never discover, who has no effect on the story other than to tell it. Thus, when we think about what we read, we can ask ourselves why a writer would choose a particular kind of narration. What does first-person narration add to a story? How does third-person narration help us understand the story? How does it affect a reader's understanding? We help ourselves as readers when we consider questions of this kind as we look at a story that we're reading. And we can add to our understanding of a story by considering another distinction within the idea of narration. The distinction between limited perspective narration and omniscient perspective narration. Now, the word omniscient comes from Greek roots, meaning all and knowledge, so we can think of omniscient narration as a state where the reader knows all characters internally. In other words, the reader has access to the inner thoughts of all the story's characters. On the other hand, limited perspective narration limits its reader to internal knowledge of a single character, or perhaps one or two characters. The reader has knowledge of only one or two characters' internal thoughts, while the other characters in the story behave the way that people in the real world do, so that we can know them only through their actions or their words. Again, thinking about why a character would choose limited or omniscient perspective in telling a story can help us think about how the writer wants us to respond to what we read. As you might imagine, we largely see limited perspective in first-person stories where the reader's knowledge is limited to the thoughts of the narrator, the person inside the story telling it, whereas third-person stories can use either limited narration or, because the voice comes from outside the story, omniscient narration. And the choice the writer makes can help us understand why the writer has written the story in that way and what we should learn from that story. So, as you keep writing and talking about stories, I suggest keeping in mind these various ways that we can describe narration. This aspect of storytelling can help us both as readers and as writers when we think about how literature works. We can think about how we want a reader to understand a story we write in the same way that we can think about how we should understand a story that someone else has written for us. Why is the story in limited perspective? Why is the story told from the third person? Answering these questions can help us decide how we understand what we read. As always, thank you for your time and attention.